Hi, and welcome to a video for Braving the Wilds of Authentic Community. And what we're going to talk about today is the do's and don'ts for sharing your story. And I'm happy to be here with my favorite son, Grant. He's also my only son. But we're excited to do this for you today. And the video that we're doing here is divided into 4 parts. And the first part is going to talk about what is the biggest problem that our churches have when it comes to authenticity. What's the issue in this? Why is it important to share our stories? We're going to talk about that, and that will be in actually the video that we're doing right now.
Yeah, and the next part that we're going over is the 12 do's and don'ts of sharing your story. There are 6 do's that we're going to go through and 6 don'ts to give you a little bit of an idea of the important aspects to share of your story and those that you kind of want to avoid.
And then the last video is going to be where I will share a little bit of how our church stumbled onto the beauty and the magic of what can happen in your church when you share your stories. And so that is where I'll tell you some of the stories that have happened out of our church and how it shaped us and transformed us, and how I think that there is a lot that we can see in the mystery of Christ and His church when we open up our lives and share our stories.
Yeah, and there's going to be 2 good ways to be able to use this video that we have. The first is for you to use on your own to kind of understand how you're going to share your story and to prepare for sharing your story. And the second way to be able to use this is in a small group. You can make a small group session out of it. It's really designed to show one section, and then we have multiple cuts where we're going to be going through the different sections to kind of create a little bit of a challenge for you and your group to be able to go through, and some questions at the end for you to ponder over with that group. We really hope that this is going to be useful for you.
So let's get going on this. So what is one of the biggest problems in our churches, and also, in America? And I think the problem, I can define it in one word for you. The problem is loneliness. And I say this because Mother Teresa has defined the poverty of America as being loneliness. And I think she's right. I think that in our churches and in our own lives, we really struggle for meaningful and authentic connection. I think we're anemic. I think sometimes you can go into a church and you can almost sense how there isn't a life-giving connection, how people don't really seem to have a sense of body inside the church. So what can we do? So we got that problem of loneliness, but what can we do as a church that can actually alleviate some of this loneliness? And I do believe that one of the answers is sharing our stories. Now, I don't believe in a lot of formulas, but there is one formula that I do believe in, and it's this. I believe that we can only be loved to the extent we are known. And so what that means is if you only know me a little bit, a tiny bit, you can only love me a little bit. But the more I open up my life and open up who I am to be known, the more you can love me. And so when we do that in the church, when we allow ourselves to be opened up and to be known by people in the church, we increase the love in our churches. And I think the best way to do that is by sharing our stories.
Yeah, and there's 4 things to know before you share your story with a group. And the first is to say that, yes, it's really scary to share your story for the first time. The first time sharing a story, you're going to miss aspects. You're not going to do it 100% correctly. You're going to stumble, and that's okay. It's important to be able to engage in the first time that you're sharing your story and really just understand that you're not going to get it completely right. But one way or the other, you're doing it for this first time. And each time that you continue sharing your story, it's just going to improve, and you're going to get more of those aspects out of it.
And there are nerves involved. You're going to be nervous.
Yeah.
You're going to feel like, if people know me, they're not going to like me. There's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be restless in you. And that's normal, and that's okay. So if you even have the thought like, this is terrifying, that's okay. That's a pretty normal response.
And that's a perfectly normal response. And out of that, don't be afraid to be real or honest for your story. And that's what's going to really make it effective. Because the more honest you are, the better your story is going to be. And it draws people in doing that. Proud and self-justifying stories, those are ones that are going to push people away, ones that try and put you in the best light possible. There's a verse, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that's really just true in the church. Lots of grace for the humble and a natural resistance for the proud. Now, you probably also don't know your own story. A lot of people don't know their own story. That's something you kind of have to figure out as you're going along. And that's why we generally like to deal with our lives in segments when we share our story, is you can do it by decades. You can do your up to 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 and so on. And that's really just one of the best ways to be able to engage and get that clear picture of what that time in your life is. And it doesn't even have to be decades. It can really just be any aspect of your life that is a portion of your life.
But the key to sharing your story, one thing that's important to this, is we want context for who you are. We want to hear about your whole life. So a lot of times in churches, and I think this is valuable, we share about how we came to Christ, or we'll talk about a crisis in our life. But when we talk about sharing our stories and what that means at City's Edge, is we want to hear the timeline. We want to hear a little bit about your childhood. We want to hear about the things that have shaped you and transformed you. And that's the part of your story that I doubt you even know. Because we do, as Grant was saying, we think of our lives in segments. But this is an opportunity for you to do the work of putting those segments together and seeing the whole picture of, what's been happening in my life and how has God been in that story. So that's why we say we don't think a lot of people even know their own stories because they themselves haven't put it together. And so oftentimes when people share their story in a small group, they themselves are hearing it for the first time.
Yeah. And I think another important thing is there's really a huge important aspect to just sharing your story with other people, because people are going to love you for sharing your story. And nothing's really going to connect you to others like being known. To the extent that you allow yourself to be known is allowing yourself that much to be opened up. So if you share this much of yourself, that's how much people are going to love you. If you share this much of yourself, that's how much people are going to love you. And so I promise you this, if you're honest, humble, and vulnerable, when you tell your story, you're going to be more loved and accepted than when you first entered the room. And this is going to be true no matter how boring or ugly or sad your story is going to be. It's worth the risk, and it's something that's going to pay off a lot with your community.
Absolutely. And I've found that to be so true. There's so many people that I've seen go in to tell their story, and they're like, this is going to do damage for my relationships with people. They're going to think less of me. They're going to be like, I'm so embarrassed of some of the pieces of my life. But when you share those things in humility and honestly, there's a lot more grace in our churches than I think we realize, and people are drawn to that. And they want to give you grace. And it's when you experience the grace of others, you are going to have a better understanding of God's grace for you. I truly believe that we need the body of Christ to communicate God's love for us. We really need that. And it's through others' acceptance and grace in our lives that we can see the grace of our God.
Absolutely. And so at this point, we're going to give you guys a question, and we want you to share a bit of your story. And kind of like, what's the first decade of your life like? And this can be ages 1 through 10, or just the first section of your life that you think is the first kind of growing segment of your life. And just kind of figure that out and be able to discuss that.
So yeah, if you're doing this for a small group, take a minute, turn off the video, and talk about that. What was the first decade of your life like? Just a heads up, you may want to use a timer for this and give everybody in your group like just 2 or 3 minutes. Otherwise, you won't get out of your house until midnight. So go ahead and do that, and blessings on your conversations. And we are so pro small groups and pro people telling your stories. And so if you have anything to share with us, please go to BethBanham.com, and I would love to hear your comments on braving the wilds of authenticity. Well done, people.
Thank you.
Welcome back. We are excited to start talking with you about the do's and don'ts of sharing your stories. And in this segment, we're going to talk about 6 things that it's important to do.
Yeah. And so let's just get right into them. So the first thing to do is to organize your thoughts. The more that you put your thoughts together, and the more that you really put into your testimony, the more that others will get out of it. And you can see countless of times people just try and wing it, and they try and go off of with like what they know or what they already have in their minds, and that's not going to get them very far.
Yeah, you don't want to wing it. And you're going to miss out on the best part of the experience of sharing your story is really learning about what God has done throughout your life. And so I really encourage people, like, if they're going to come to my house and they're going to share their story, I want to see them show up with something in their hands. I said, I don't care if you write it out on toilet paper, but I want to see you come prepared so that I know that you've been processing your stuff and dealing with it. And so that is a big thing. Prepare. Make sure that you organize your thoughts and do the work.
And however you prepare, just make sure that you do it in a way that works for you. Whether you do it in an outline form or if you have a PowerPoint, anything along those lines. Put it in a way that you can read it and access it pretty easily and understand it as you're going along. Don't have something that you're just going down and looking at like a book, trying to read it just word for word. That's not the best way to do it. But find something that really suits you in a way that can keep you engaged with the people that you're sharing it with. So I think the second thing to do is be creative. There are a lot of different ways to be able to share your story, and this can go in regards to, like, you can do a PowerPoint presentation, you can stand in front of the group and share it, you can do it by a question and answer format. I have even done it before in a stick figure format when I first started sharing my story. But
You literally drew stick figures.
I drew stick figures.
I'm
I'm not an artist. I'm not
He's
an
not
artist.
an artist, but it was so great because he would show pictures of different parts of his life with stick figures.
Yeah, and so be creative in how you share your story and really just engage in a way that is unique to you or whatever works best for you. Talk about the things that really matter in your life and explain it in a way that is incredibly personal to you, about relationships or the spiritual experiences and formations that you've had through each decade.
We've seen people use poetry. We've seen people bring photos to share. We've seen people bring objects that represent different parts of their life. I think my favorite one was when this lady, Lisa, did it in Choose Your Own Adventure. If you remember those Choose Your Own Adventure series, and she's like had these books that she made covers for, and if you think I did this with my life, I'll share this piece with you. So it's a great opportunity to be creative. And a simple way to do that, as Grant mentioned before, is just go through decades of your life. You can share it that way. That's creative.
Yeah. And another thing that's really important, the third thing, is do keep it honest. It's really tempting to hide away the ugly and unpleasant sides of your story and say that it all is nice and shiny and tidy or smoothed over at the end. And good stories are really the most honest and transparent ones. They're not ones where you're trying to prove something or trying to prove your worth or that you're 100% better now. Like, the real stories and the best ones are the ugly ones and the honest ones.
And what's interesting about the church is I think we've lost the art of confession. And there's something about giving space to people to share their stories and to kind of confess their lives, confess their mistakes, confess their stuff, that is a beautiful gift to the church. It's something that I think we're called to do as believers. And I think that sharing our stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is an awesome way to do confession. And bring it back to the church where it belongs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fourth point that we have is do endure the grieving.
Yeah, endure the grieving. And so what we mean by this is oftentimes it's hard to work through your stories. I had a guy named Stephen in my kitchen this last week, and he goes, I'm sad, I think about my story, and it makes me feel icky. Those aren't exactly his words, but he was struggling with the grieving process of looking at your life and looking at the places of loss and the places of hurt. And what the women in my church told me one time when I was going to speak at a retreat is they said, let people know that sharing your stories, that it's hard. Expect it to be hard, but do it because it's so worth it. Because in that releasing of our stuff and confessing our stuff and grieving our stuff, we do find healing. And it does happen, so it's worth it. So if you find yourself feeling icky and grieving, that's part of it. And you may want to even get a few people to pray for you and just say, look, I am going through stuff. I just need prayer support in this. And that's valuable. I encourage that too.
I think the next point is number 5, do tell your story over and over again. When we share our story the first time, as I've said before, you miss a lot of things. You're not going to get it 100% correctly. And when you share your story multiple times and engage multiple times, you pick up new things. You remember new things. You're kind of going through it again. You're going through your story again not necessarily just for them, but for you,
Mm-hmm.
because you're reliving these things and you're understanding these things in a new light. And so you're gonna come up with a lot of new information, and you're really gonna be able to get a better point of your experiences and a better understanding of how you grew up and the things that affected you.
How many times do you think you've shared your story?
I think I've shared my story probably about 7 or 8 times at this point.
Yeah, I've probably shared my story about 10 times. And every time I do it, it's valuable. And no two ways that I share my story are the same. And so depending on, what God is doing in my life at the present time, I can see my past and what God is molding in me through that pair of glasses. So it's really valuable to share your story again and again and again.
Yeah. And for me at least, it wasn't just me sharing my story in different ways every time. Still did the stick figure thing recently, that was pretty fun. But there's new things that I remember every time, and there's new questions that I can answer every time. And it's really kind of special to be able to go back at it and see where you're at your stage in life compared to where you were when you last shared your story, and what you've learned since then about things that happened during that time or things that happened before that. And so just getting that perspective makes all the world of difference. I think our 6th point that we have is do invite people to interact and ask questions about your story. And this is really going to help you feel understood. One of the best things about this is you get that level of engagement where you can see that people actually do care about your story. And feel free to just open it up and say to certain things, I don't know. Because you may not know everything about your story yet, but as long as you're willing to engage on that front, people are going to actually understand your story better and show that they do care.
And that they get it. You're right.
Yeah.
It's something we want to be understood. The other thing that I've discovered is oftentimes when we're vulnerable and we share our stories, we have 2 questions that we don't say out loud. And one of the questions is, did I freak you out? And the second question is, do you still like me? And so one of the things that happens when people can interact with your story and ask you questions, they're saying, you didn't freak me out. I want to hear more. And yes, I still like you. So that is why I think at the end of sharing your story, it's important to have some space and time to say, does anybody have any thoughts or questions? And let people interact with you. That time can be priceless. Absolutely. And at the next video, like the one that I do at the end, I will talk about some of the interaction and how that has been almost as powerful as the storytelling themselves.
Yeah. So now we have our question for the group, and for you if you're going through this by yourself. When you think about sharing your story, how nervous are you on a scale of 1 to 10? 1 is not nervous and 10 is incredibly nervous.
And how well do you think others know you? And how well do you think you know others? And so even think about people that are close to you. It's do they really know, why you get upset when somebody, I don't know, I can't make something up here. but there's a lot of triggers that we have in our lives. There's a lot of things that we over-respond to, and a lot of those kind of things can be from something that's happened in our childhood. And so do they know enough of the context of you to understand why you respond to situations and things the way that you do? So how well do you think others know you, and how well do you think you know others?
And what has been your best ways to get to know others authentically? And this is a good thing to think of, what prompts have gotten you the furthest in engaging with other people? What questions have you asked that have really clicked in communicating with other people and learning about their stories?
And what context? Have you found that you connect best with people at a retreat, or over coffee, or over a meal, or in a small group? So I think those are great things to talk about, what are some of the best ways that you've found to have authentic and meaningful connection? All right.
All right, so we're back here now, and we're going to be going through the don'ts of sharing your story out of our 12 do's and don'ts of how to share your testimony and story to other people. The first one we have is don't get wordy. Don't spend more than 40 minutes sharing your story. You're going to lose people's attention. That's why organizing your thoughts and actually coming in with an outline is so helpful, is because you're going to kind of at some level understand your time constraint. You won't be able to say everything, so choose what you talk about very, very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Keep going. You're on it.
Yeah. The next point that we have is don't get preachy. This isn't the time to be able to put your moral lessons into whatever story you have. Don't turn your story into a sermon. There have been plenty of times where I've worked at a camp and I've seen some of the kids there try and turn their story into a lesson without even sometimes realizing it. But they try to engage on that different level and prove something about themselves, and that just ends up distancing the other people from them a little bit more because it creates this separation of I'm a little bit better than you, or I know this more than you, and there's a pride that sometimes can come with sharing your testimony, and that's something that you really do want to avoid.
Exactly. And don't tidy up what isn't tidy. And we're good Christians, and so we want to have things that we share be resolved. We want to have those moral lessons. We want to have the tidy ending, be able to tie it all up in a bow, and, wasn't God good, and what a finished product you are, amen. But don't tidy it. Let it sit raw. And I think it's important to have things in our story that we haven't resolved, things that haven't been made tidy, things that we're still dealing with. And so I give you all freedom, just leave it messy. Leave the stuff that's messy, and don't feel the need to tidy everything up.
Yeah, another important thing is don't get lost in the details. It can be really easy to drift into the details of a conversation. You can have people that can focus on one simple detail, and you go on that for a very, very long span of time.
For example, I've seen people sharing their stories, and they start talking about their best friend in second grade, and then what their friend's family life was like, and then all of a sudden it's not about their story anymore, it's about their second grade friend. And so keep on track. That's why, again, we say it again and again, organize your thoughts. Because if you're just going to sit there and reminisce in a room in front of people, it's boring. So, and you see people, like, their body language changes because they're looking up here and we used to do this, and they've lost the track of thought, and they've lost the connection with you. And so don't get lost in the details, and really, again, do the work of organizing your thoughts.
And also, the next point is don't think your story is boring or insignificant. Almost everyone feels like their story isn't as interesting or exciting as the stories of others. I was, and I am, a pastor's kid who's grown up in a Christian church with Christian friends, and I was raised a Christian life. And there's a lot of aspects of that always made me doubt that my story was going to be as significant as anybody else's.
He doesn't have the drug years. We're so grateful.
Yeah,
or,
it's it's kind of having that fear of my story just isn't as exciting as other people's, and it's not going to matter as much. And I'm going to tell you right now that your story, one way or another, it doesn't matter how boring it is, but it does really, really matter. Sharing your story with other people is huge, and not just about, like, for the sake of yourself, but for the sake of other people simply knowing you better.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. No story is boring if you put your heart into it and you don't go too long. So definitely, and many people feel like, even people who have had like traumatic experiences can feel like their stories are boring or insignificant. And that's a natural feeling, but it's not true. Everybody's story is valuable, and everyone will benefit from each other's story, no matter what that entails.
And on the inverse of that, don't be afraid if your story has some really dark stuff in it. Don't be afraid to share what you feel like you can share in that regard, because you can either not be bored by a story. Like, I haven't been traumatized by hearing someone's story yet. It doesn't make me like you any less when I hear any sort of stories like that.
And he's heard some wild ones.
Yeah.
In our church, we have people that have been through a lot, and we were parents that were like, Grant, we want you to experience authentic community. Even when you were like 10 and 11 years old, you were hearing some stories that were pretty intense.
So one way or the other, just don't be afraid to share your story in any capacity. The last point that we have is don't forget to talk about your spiritual journey. Even if you didn't have a very spiritual childhood like I did, you probably had thoughts that made you draw towards God and His people, or led you to resist all of that as well. Make sure to share the important aspects of your spiritual journey, your spiritual life, and make sure to just keep that as an aspect, because it really does matter when sharing that.
It's easy to, not easy, but I have seen a couple people do it that will share their whole story, and you're like, where was God in it? And they had that experience, but it didn't enter their story. And so the reason that we bring this up is because God is doing stuff in our lives from before we were born. There's so much going on. And so it's important, when you're putting your story together, to just pay attention. Like, what was God lining up for you? Where did you sense his presence? Where was he in the story? Where did you struggle with him? Where did you feel like he wasn't there? Like, all of that. But just bring it into every piece of your story. Where was God and what was he doing?
Yeah.
And those are our 6 don'ts.
Yeah.
So we've shared the 6 do's and we've shared the 6 don'ts.
And so at this point, we also have the prompt for you as well. Which of the don'ts do you think the people you are close with are most susceptible to? And on that side, which of those don'ts do you think that you're most susceptible to? Where are you going to make those biggest mistakes? What do you think is going to be the hardest for you to back off on or do differently? So just try and keep an aspect of that in your mind, of looking at the stories of other people and looking at the story of yourself and see, what are some of those things I'm really going to struggle with in sharing my story? What's really going to matter there, and what can I do differently?
Exactly. Is your struggle going to be with getting too wordy? Is it that you have a tendency to get preachy? Or you want to tidy things up that shouldn't be tidied? Or you go into details, you can get lost in your own thoughts. What are the other 2, Grant?
Yeah, don't be afraid to think, like, if you think your story is insignificant.
Yeah.
I know that's a problem with a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Or not adding your spiritual journey in there and focusing on just all the material aspects of your life. These are all things that you could conceivably struggle with, and all things that it's going to be important to look into. And so
go ahead and do that. In this video, I want to talk to you about 4 things that happen when we share our stories. And those 4 things are that it opens the door to worship, it opens the door to love, opens the door to healing, and opens the door to other people's stories. You see, in our story, and this is how does it open the door to worship? Our stories open the door to worship because in every one of our stories is the gospel. It's the message of Christ. It's a story of redemption. If you look at our lives, you see the hand of God moving us towards himself. And then oftentimes we have strong stories of forgiveness and grace. So that's why I believe when we share our stories in a room full of people, we are opening up the gospel to others. We're opening up things about God that we've learned. People will see and understand things about God in that room, and will be drawn to just worship and love God more because of our stories and what we share. The second thing is our stories open ourselves up to be loved and to love others. So like we've said before in this video a couple times, is we do believe that we can only be loved to the extent that we're known. And so when we're sharing our stories, we're opening our lives up and letting people love different parts of us that may have never been loved or seen before. I think about the first time we ever had people's stories shared in our living room was a number of years ago. I had this lady in my church. She was in her mid-30s, and her and her husband were just starting to come to our church. There were a couple other couples that I thought, I'd like to get them in my home. I want people to connect. Dan and I are passionate about hospitality and opening up our home and getting people to connect with others. So it wasn't unusual. But I had this idea. I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have these people share their stories with each other? I'd never done it, never seen it done, but it just seemed like kind of a fun idea. So I invited these 3 couples to my house, and I said, here's the deal. I want you to come to my house for dinner. It's a trap, and I have an agenda, so come at your own risk. And you know what? They all showed up. I mean, who's going to miss that? I think there's something about playing with people's curiosity, like, I don't want to miss that. What do you have for a plan for my life? So they all showed up. And I said this. I said, I'm glad you guys are here. I want to get to know you guys better. How would you feel if each week we each took turns sharing our stories? I'll continue to make dinners for you guys on Tuesday nights if you guys will take turns sharing your stories. And they're like, yeah, we're game. We'll do it. And so we started doing that. We started sharing our stories with each other. And Alyssa, the lady that I mentioned who was in her mid-30s, was one of the first people to share her story. And when she was sharing it, she talked about how she had gotten pregnant when she was 19 years old. And she didn't have a kid that I was aware of. This was something about her that I didn't even know. And I was wondering, did she have an abortion? Did the child die? Like, my mind is going, what happened? And as her story continued, we found out that she had given this child up for adoption. She certainly wasn't ready at 19 or in a relationship that was stable enough to have a kid. So when she was done sharing her story, we started asking questions. And I said, do you keep in touch with this kid? She goes, oh yeah. I said, do you have a picture? She goes, yeah. And so she has been in contact with the child and with the family that cares for her child that had adopted him. And so she got out of her wallet a picture of him, and we passed it around the room. And the whole room got to acknowledge this piece of her life. And I asked her, I said, so is this a secret? Is this something that you don't want people to know? And she goes, no, I don't. She goes, I kind of want people to know. But how do you bring it up? How do you bring it up? And that was my first moment where I said, I wonder what else is in the room that people want to have known for us to understand them and who they are, that there's just no opportunity out there to bring it up. And then the next week, her husband shared his story. And when he shared his story, there was a lot of daddy issues involved, a lot of father stuff that was hard that he had to deal with. And when he was done sharing his story, the guys started interacting. Now there's 4 girls in my living room, there's 4 guys, and all the girls got really quiet as the 4 men all started talking about the issues and struggles they had with their dads. And I'm like, man, this is priceless. This never happens. Look at the conversations that sharing stories opens up in my living room. I'm like, we have to do this more. And so we became so passionate about it and couldn't believe the fruit and the love and just the intense trust and loyalty it was creating in our church that we continue doing this more and more. Right now, I think we're a small church. We're only about 120 people. But 77% of the people in our church who are over the age of 18 have shared their story in front of a group of 8 people or more. It's in the culture of what we do now. And so as you can imagine, you can sit in a room, here we are in my church building, and I know the stories. We all know the stories of each other. And that's powerful. And so how it often happens is it may start with a conversation in a living room, and it may turn into a small group where people share their stories. And then we've had a number of people from that who have said, I'm open to sharing in front of the church. And that has been life-giving to us. It's been powerful. There's so many stories of the goodness of God, of His grace, and the gospel enters the room every time we have someone share their story. The third thing that our stories do is they open the door to healing. And I think about some of the things that have been in our church and some of the pain and the darkness that has never had a space to come forward and experience healing. And I think one of the best examples of this one is Stacy, who comes to our church. And she knew that we were doing stories and talking about, talk about the ugly, talk about your life honestly. And she said, I want to have you and Dan over for dinner, my husband, because I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. And I need healing, and you say that stories work. If we share it, that somehow we heal. So would you do that? Would you come over for dinner? I said, yeah, sure. And so I went over to her house for dinner. Dan and I did, and we got done, and we were sitting in her living room on the couches. And she said, okay, here goes. She said, when I was 7 years old, I was molested by a 9-year-old boy. And she said, I have so much shame around that because I know it's my fault. I know, I could have said no, and just the guilt and the shame was so thick there. And she goes, I'm telling you this because I'm hoping that if I say something out loud about the secret that I've had, that maybe it'll loosen up that guilt and that shame. And that's such an easy one. What 7-year-old is culpable to something like that? That was just easy as pie. And so I'm sitting in our living room, I've heard the story, and I said, Stacy, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 meaning it's not your fault at all, 10 meaning you're totally culpable and it's all your fault, I said, you're a 0. And I gave her a hug, and I said, you're a 0. And she started tearing up. She goes, I'm a 0? I'm a 0? And I'm like, yeah, you're a 0. And it was just like you could see some healing happen in her. Well, she shared her story with our church, and I shared the story about, you're a 0. And so anyway, we're sitting in the back couches that way. If you're in my building, you'd see the couches. And I was sitting there after church with a group of women. And we were talking about being zeros and how maybe some of us aren't zeros. Maybe some of us are like a 7. And we're kind of going around kind of judging each other in the way that we do in our church with this radical transparency. And some of these women were making really poor relationship decisions that when they were like 18 or 17. And they said, hey, I was culpable. It's not like that would be abuse, but I was culpable. So what do I do if I'm a 7? And so then we started like rating each other because we knew each other's lives. Yeah, you're totally an 8. Yeah, you might be a 3. It was just, anyway, had to be there. Can't believe that my church has that kind of trust sometimes, but it was fun to be in the room. But what we came up with as we're talking about that and talking about what about if our culpability is not 0 but like a 6, that's when we started thinking about how Jesus and his work on the cross make us a 0. He takes whatever number we are and he makes it a 0. And the understanding of the gospel in our lives skyrocketed that day. And in that group of women, as we talked about that, our understanding of Jesus and what he does with our culpability and with our sin was profound. And I think about how that was opened up because Stacy shared her story and these women at the couch shared their stories. That's a powerful moment. And so now what we decided is we're all zeros. And so it was a code in our church for a while. We give each other hugs and say, hey, you're a 0. But that is how the gospel showed up through a story for a number of us. And then the other thing that it did is the amount of healing that happens through that is profound. So when Stacy shared that story with my husband and I, it's like her guilt and her shame went down a notch. And then she shared it with a few other people and it went down another notch. And then she shared it in our church and it went down another notch. And then, she gave me permission to share the story when I speak and to share it with you. And now it is a story of redemption. It's a story of what God can do. It's a story of what it means to be a 0. And it has opened up the stories of others, and that's powerful. And so the shame that she had that was so tight and so put her in so much bondage for so many years, that was broken when she was able to share her story and experience the grace and love of others. So the last thing, sharing our stories opens the door to the stories of others. And again, Stacy's such a great example of that. As we were sitting on the back couch and we were talking about culpability in our stories, one of the girls who was 16 had a boyfriend that was in his 30s, but she knew what she was doing. And so even that turned into a time of confession for something that had happened in her past that she had felt conflicted over or shame over. And so people they're far more open to share their stories if they don't feel like they're going to be the project in your church. So when it's a culture, and that's what you do, everyone talks about their stuff, it's so much easier to lay your stuff out there. So it's definitely true that sharing our stories opens up the stories of others. And so today at City's Edge, it's probably been 15 years or more that we've been sharing our stories. I have people on my list right now, 3 or 4 of them, that have been in our church for a while, that I'm working on creating an opportunity for them to come in and share their story in front of a group of people. And I encourage you guys to do that, to bring the gospel into your churches by bringing people's stories to the table, to bring confession back into the church by sharing stories, to bring healing into your church by sharing stories. It's powerful, it's life-changing, it's transforming. And it can be done. It can be done in small ways. Invite 2 people to your house and take turns with just the 3 of you sharing stories. And let those things build, and let Christ build those things. And I encourage you to, I hope you're inspired by this. I hope that you're not discouraged by this, by feeling like maybe my church can't do that. I can't imagine them doing this. Start small. Start with one other person and let the Lord do his thing. Let him begin to unfold his gospel through the stories of others. Thank you.